On a quiet morning at Arlington National Cemetery, an unexpected confrontation unfolded, one that challenged honor, courage, and the very meaning of justice. What happened next would ripple far beyond the grave, revealing a story of strength that refuses to be silent. If this story moved you, please like, comment, and subscribe. Your support helps give light to voices that deserve to be seen and heard. That morning at Arlington National Cemetery, a thin veil of mist drifted softly over the grounds, cloaking the sorrow in a fragile white embrace. The American flag hung at half-staff, heavy in the cool early March breeze, its somber weight pressing down on the still air. Every footstep of the soldiers walking across the dry grass sliced sharply through the silence, as if sound itself had become a rare intrusion. Beneath the ancient oak's sprawling canopy, rows of black-draped chairs stood perfectly aligned, silent sentinels holding space for the fallen soldier's family. They sat upright, stiff as flagpoles, unwilling to bend beneath the weight of grief. Children wore miniature uniforms, adults adjusted medals with trembling hands. Every eye remained fixed, unwavering, on the flag-draped casket, resting solemnly at the center of the ceremony. Not a word was spoken, not a cough dared break the reverent hush. This was a military funeral, a sacred ritual where outward emotions were hushed to make room for the one truth allowed to shine: honor. A sleek black SUV slipped quietly through a side gate, its engine nearly silent. The rear door opened and polished leather shoes touched the ground with gentle authority. The figure who stepped out commanded immediate respect. The nearby guards saluted instinctively, almost unconsciously. Elise Monroe appeared, her uniform crisp and immaculate, the rank of general pinned sharply to her left shoulder, a symbol earned only by those who had survived more battles than most could imagine. She came alone, no entourage, no fanfare, carrying only a small urn wrapped in black cloth, the final tribute to a comrade she had once commanded. Her face was steady, cold, and composed, but it was the quiet determination in her measured steps that caused everyone present to rise. Not from fear, but from the deep recognition of witnessing something rare, a general coming to honor a fallen soldier. But not everyone stood. Robert Hasker, the officer assigned to security on the cemetery's west perimeter, planted himself firmly in the SUV's path. His palm slammed harshly against the hood, with a sharp crack that shattered the solemnity. The young soldier holding the flag nearby flinched so hard the wooden pole slipped from his grasp and struck the ground with a dry snap. The entire assembly froze. A child in the front row, dressed in a miniature uniform, looked up at his mother and whispered, "Is that man yelling at her?" The mother's fingers tightened around her mourning cloth as she bowed her head, silent, holding herself together by sheer force. Elise did not flinch. Her unblinking gaze drifted slowly from the red mark left on Hasker's hand to his cold gray eyes, empty and unforgiving like unfinished concrete. She took no step back. Hasker didn't ask for permission. He didn't seek approval. He advanced, blocking her path, his contempt barely concealed. "I thought you were with the choir," he spat, eyes mocking the stars on her shoulder like cheap souvenirs, unworthy of the general they represented. The two guards exchanged glances but stood their ground. Elise calmly produced a small leather wallet, withdrew her military ID with textbook precision, and held it aloft. Silent. Hasker barely glanced before scoffing loud enough for all to hear. "They fake these things real well nowadays, especially the ones trying to prove something." A stifled noise emerged from the seated mourners, perhaps clenched teeth or quiet sobs. But Elise's face remained an unyielding mask. She lowered her arm, tucked away the ID, and took one deliberate step toward the casket. Hasker raised his arm to block her, voice low and threatening. "You can't go through. This is a restricted ceremonial zone. You're not on the approved list." Behind them, an older veteran leaned toward a former army captain and murmured, "Are we burying a soldier, or are we burying honor itself?" The question rippled quietly through the crowd, striking a deep chord. No one intervened. not because they agreed with Hasker, but because none knew if standing up would mean the system would stand with them. Above, the sky darkened a shade deeper, and a sudden gust fluttered the flag on the casket briefly before it settled again motionless, like a silent prayer bowed in respect. Elise did not move forward, nor did she retreat. Her black shoes stood just inches from Hasker's, her grip tight on the urn wrapped in black cloth, holding a memory fragile and sacred. Her gaze neither asked for permission nor sought validation. She was a living monument amid the funeral, cleaved by prejudice, authority, and the fear of those unwilling to witness someone like her claim a space they thought belonged only to themselves. Then, in that frozen moment, the memorial was pierced by the motion of a hand holding a gun. A hand that had no place here. One truth rang louder than any rank or command. This was no battlefield. This was a funeral. And at this funeral, the one meant to be honored had been replaced by a cruel display of dominance. Elise didn't need a voice to announce her presence. Her name and the act she was about to withhold were etched not in ink but in the shiver that traveled down every spine watching. She stood firm, a boundary unyielding, impossible to breach. Her left hand clutched the urn of the fallen soldier, her right hand withdrew the military ID once dismissed. The midday sun shifted, casting a cold light that gleamed off the metal of the card, reminding all who looked that the letters engraved there were forged not in ink, but in blood, sweat, and years of sacrifice. But in the face of that silent defiance, Hasker saw only rebellion. He stepped forward, grabbed the card in a sudden rough motion that made her jacket tremble, and raised it high, exposing it to the sun like a counterfeit bill, scrutinized in the harsh light of a flea market. Then, with deliberate cruelty, he spat onto the grass at her feet, not missing by an inch. The entire area froze once more. Boots stopped mid-step. Something shifted. Suspicion gave way to something darker. Intent. A young white soldier, barely out of his teens, leaned forward, ready to speak, but the firm hand of a superior pressed on his shoulder, whispering 4 quiet words. Not the time yet. The soldier froze, not from fear, but from understanding. In the military, not the time isn't just a phrase. It's a warning. Any move off screen comes with a cost, and right now the one paying that price was a general, standing before the invisible muzzle of a weapon called doubt. The ID card stayed clenched in Hasker's hand. He didn't return it. Instead he held it up, tilting it side to side, sneering with cold contempt. "They make good fakes these days," he said, loud enough for the perimeter cameras to catch every word. "Places like Baltimore, Chicago's, swarming with these. Looks real if you squint, but people who need to prove they matter always buy these things, especially when they can't earn their rank on merit." His tone wasn't raised. He didn't shout, but the way he pressed each consonant down, like heavy boots grinding into sand, made every word land like a slow, icy stab. Unnoticed by most, hidden in the bushes just beyond the ceremonial zone, a group of journalism students were quietly filming. One phone began live streaming, its angle perfect. It caught Hasker's sneer, his grip on the ID, the urn clenched in Monroe's hand, and the unwavering gaze she fixed on him. The weak 4G signal blurred the image, but within minutes the feed exploded across a military forum under a blazing red headline. "Cop interrogates 4-star general live during funeral." Elise Monroe remained silent. No rebuttal, no defense, no reaction. That silence filled the space more than words ever could. She didn't need to shout to be heard. Instead, she stepped forward, face to face with Hasker, close enough that his breath brushed her collar. Her eyes held no anger, no coldness, just a steady gaze that felt like looking into a mirror, forcing him to confront himself stripped bare of rank and excuses. Her voice dropped, calm and precise, not weak, but knowing her words carried weight without volume. "You're not doubting the card," Elise said slowly, each word sharp and deliberate. "You're doubting that someone like me has the right to carry it." No thunderclap followed, no dramatic cue, just a hush so profound that her words echoed in the wind and through the heartbeats of everyone holding their breath. Heads turned, even those who had looked away before, because they had never seen defiance this chilling. It was a resistance so cold, so quiet, it strangled the accuser's sense of honor. Hasker's lips tightened. For the first time his face faltered, not with shame, but because the blow came silently, like a frozen blade cutting deeper than any shout could. Yet he didn't step back. He didn't know how. More importantly, he wasn't allowed to. To retreat in front of a black woman bearing 4 stars meant admitting a truth he'd spent his life denying. The system was no longer on his side. "You're quite the speaker," he hissed. "But according to protocol, an ID doesn't prove identity. The authority to verify belongs to me, and I haven't finished verifying." His words landed like a trap. Not to restrain a person, but to drag a sacred ritual into the mud of personal malice. The crowd stayed silent, but phones were drawn. Not to call for help, but to record the moment when a man sworn to uphold the law used his power to humiliate someone sworn to serve unconditionally. Monroe didn't flinch. She reached out to take back her card. Hasker gripped it tighter, holding it just a moment longer, like a man desperate to clutch his last drop of control. Then, with swift authority, she pulled it back, not violently, but decisively. The sharp tap of metal against her fingernail cut through the wind like a knife. Without a word, she turned and walked away, leaving Hasker standing speechless, hand empty, mouth agape. As he scrambled for a response, a notification buzzed on a soldier's phone. Live stream. Cop versus General. Over 120,000 watching. No order was given. No slogans were shouted. But from the front row, a mother whose child wore a miniature uniform slowly rose, not to protest, but to walk toward the casket. She didn't look at Hasker, she looked at Monroe and nodded, an unspoken acknowledgement that something old had ended and something new had quietly begun. In that moment, no one dared say the funeral had been interrupted. Only those with eyes to see understood that the real burial was just beginning. Not for the soldier in the coffin, but for everything this country once held untouchable. Monroe stepped forward, not rushed, not hesitant, but with the steady weight of someone who had once crossed battle lines and faced life and death without asking permission. Her polished black shoes, pressed into the compacted earth, cracked and dry from heat, now bearing the weight of a woman who refused submission. Her hands gripped the urn steady, not a speck of ash shaken loose. Each breath marked a line drawn in the sand. Each step forward questioned everyone present. Who truly has the right to approach? Hasker blinked once, then growled, no longer sarcastic, but fully threatening, "You stop right now." His voice dragged like iron chains scraping concrete. No one saw when his fingers reached for his Glock, but the metallic scrape of the gun sliding free tore through the sacred silence like nails on glass, cold, shrill, utterly out of place. Everyone heard it, but no one believed it. Monroe stood her ground, neither advancing nor retreating, face to face with the muzzle aimed straight at her chest. No wind stirred. Yet the national flag atop the casket fluttered faintly, as if reminding everyone here that within this silent cemetery the only thing alive was honor. Intractive on it was now staring down the barrel. "We'll have a new executive who tries to move those high-security hides in a prison off the grid, and I'll take it as a threat." The funeral held its breath. No one dared speak or move. Every eye waited, not for what would happen next, but to see who would bear the weight of what did. Then the unthinkable happened. He shouted, not because anyone resisted, but as the final roar of a man realizing he'd lost control. "I said, stop." The volume cracked the still air. At the head of the casket, the soldier's portrait tilted, then toppled, shattering on the ground. Glass cracked, the frame split open, and the photo of the young soldier who had died on a distant border rolled across the grass, coming to rest at Monroe's feet. Every eye clung to that moment like a lifeline in the depths of grief. In the heart of a funeral, a soldier had died again, not from enemy fire but from the collapse of dignity. A lieutenant to the left reacted on instinct and yelled, "Everyone back!" His voice cut through the air like the distant horn of an old train, echoing, fading. But no one moved, no one dared retreat. It wasn't because they didn't hear. They did. They knew stepping back now meant accepting that a cop could pull a gun inside a military cemetery, and no one would lift a finger to stop it. A white man in uniform, bearing the rank of colonel and standing beside Hasker, slowly stepped aside. He said nothing. His polished shoes crossed the edge of the paved walkway as his eyes fixed not on Monroe or the gun, but on the flag-draped casket, as if reminding himself why he was there, not to side with Hasker, but to honor a soldier who gave his life for their country. Monroe didn't flinch. The photo at her feet reflected the face of the fallen soldier, the man who had called her commander, the one who had entrusted his life to her hands. She didn't bend down to pick it up, not out of disrespect, but because a bowed head in that moment would have been misunderstood forever. Instead, she adjusted her grip on the urn, holding it upright. The earth beneath her cracked dry, yet her stance did not shift a single millimeter. No gasps, no pleading glances, just her presence, like a mountain standing resolute between violence and honor. She looked directly into Hasker's eyes, her voice calm and clear, needing no volume to pierce the still air. "If I die here," she said, "the whole country will know why." No heartbeat missed a beat. No one could explain why those words silenced everything, not because they were a threat, but because they were a statement, a sworn testimony, a permanent record. Hasker knew. He knew the upper hand was gone. His hand didn't tremble, but his eyes broke for a fleeting moment. Several rows back, the mother holding the hand of a young boy dressed in a miniature uniform clenched tight. The boy didn't cry. He simply looked up at Monroe and the gun with eyes still unshaped by prejudice or numbness, and whispered, "Mom, is he scared of her?" The mother didn't answer. No one did, because that innocent question pierced the silence, touching on a truth no one dared speak aloud. The man holding the gun was afraid of losing control. A gentle breeze passed, not strong, not cold, but enough to lift the flag atop the casket once again. In the fading sunlight, the flag's edge flashed like a scar against the black fabric. In a place where guns should never exist, one had appeared. And the only thing standing between that weapon and irreversible tragedy was a woman, still standing tall, eyes unshaken, hands steady. No one moved. No phones appeared. No screams shattered the silence. All stood frozen, framed perfectly in a moment that needed no caption. This was no longer about a cop and a general. This was about someone striving to preserve honor and someone clinging to privilege. One stood ready to endure. The other stood ready to fire. Between them lay the death of a soldier and the fragile survival of a principle called justice. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the Glock in Hasker's hand felt redundant in a scene where every heartbeat was a moral test. The wind stopped. The flag ceased to flutter. The cracks in the earth beneath Monroe's feet resembled fault lines, running straight into the system she now faced. Not with weapons or force, but with the sheer presence of a woman in uniform standing upright on soil long accustomed to bowing to white authority. Monroe's eyes did not shift from the photo beneath her, the image of the fallen soldier now lying between the muzzle and the commander who once led him. No breath was heard, yet everyone sensed something rising from the depths of silence, a tremor not yet shaking, but already fracturing the earth beneath them. Then, to her left, a silver-hailed three-star general, his scalp closely shaved, gripped his cane tightly. He leaned forward, not from reverence, but because he could no longer stand fully upright. His hand trembled, fingers white from the grip. A tear rolled slowly down his dry cheek, not from fear but shame. Shame for what had been allowed to happen. Shame because he, like many others, had stayed silent far too long. "Don't," he whispered, not to anyone in particular. As long as you keep standing, we might still save the system." His voice was old but not weak. He was not pleading, but a sentence passed down to his generation, the ones who built walls of honor but let cracks like Hasker slip through unnoticed. Monroe didn't turn to him. She heard him, but her gaze remained fixed on one point: the space between the gun and the ritual, where honor was being shredded by a man who didn't understand that in the military not everyone is allowed to aim a gun, and no one is allowed to aim it at sacrifice. Hasker held his ground. His jaw clenched tight. Sweat ran backward across his temple, not from tension, but from the dawning realization that he no longer controlled the silence surrounding him. He wasn't used to standing without obedience. He wasn't used to having his threat undone by a steady gaze. The longer he stood, the more restless he became. Above, a soft buzzing sound appeared, a drone hovering mid-air. No one knew its source, but its lens was zoomed steadily on Hasker's face. Not the frantic zoom of media crews, but a slow, deliberate focus, as if etching every wrinkle, every bead of sweat, every twitch of his expression into a permanent record. He knew it. He could do nothing. He couldn't aim his gun at it. He couldn't shut it off. All he could do was stand there, a crime not yet named. Behind him, in the honor guard formation, a young soldier quietly stepped back and reached into his backpack. He pulled out a second flag, tightly rolled inside a waterproof sleeve. It wasn't meant to replace the main flag. It was backup. And that word backup spoke louder than any speech. Because in a military funeral, no one prepares a second flag unless they expect something might go wrong. They knew. They knew someone might break the ritual. Someone might draw a weapon. And the soldiers had come prepared, not to mourn honor a second time. Monroe gently lifted her right heel and set it back down exactly where it had been. Though slight, most missed it, but it was a final message. She wasn't retreating. She wasn't advancing. She wasn't retaliating. Nor was she evading. In her hands was the urn of the fallen soldier. On her chest, rows of medals pinned by 3 different presidents. But what kept her grounded in that moment wasn't the honor she'd received. It was what she had chosen to hold. At last, Hasker spoke. He didn't yowl. His voice was slow and laced with something faintly resembling fear. "You're provoking me on purpose. I have the right to respond if I feel threatened." No one answered. But the cold, unmoving looks from the crowd made his words fall to the ground like an unspent shell, self-defeating, rejected before they could land. And Monroe? The elderly? The general turned his head away. Not because he didn't want to see, but because he couldn't bear to watch a man convince himself that drawing a gun at a funeral counted as feeling threatened. At his age, he had witnessed countless deaths, but perhaps never one as shameful as this. The death of military integrity, strangled by the phrase, "I have the right." The air in the cemetery thickened, as if each speck of dust carried unbearable weight. A dry leaf drifted down near Monroe's shoe, landing without a sound. A small detail, but proof that time still moved forward. Only the system was stuck, caught between honor and authority, between those willing to stand straight and those merely straining to appear righteous. A distant car horn broke the suspended silence. No one knew where it came from, but no one moved. Everyone understood that the next chapter of this day would not be written by the press, nor decided by politicians. It would be shaped by those silent witnesses present, those who saw a gun drawn before a casket, a general denied the right to approach her fallen comrade, those who would never again say "I" without carrying the weight of this moment. The people there didn't just witness the truth, they became part of it. Hasker remained frozen, clutching the Glock, his eyes scanning the stiff faces around him, searching for justification, but no one met his gaze, no nods, no support. Then, as if the authority he'd wielded evaporated, his shoulders sagged slightly. The tension between gun and target dissolved into something else. A soft click sounded behind him. 2 military security officers, clad in dark ballistic vests and hands ready on their weapons, approached. No orders were given, but everyone knew. A chapter had closed. without gunfire, without shouting. Hasker sensed the presence, turned, but before he could react, one officer raised a hand and commanded with unmistakable military cadence, "Drop your weapon." Hasker scoffed, unmoved. "Political cosplay. You think this is a movie?" His voice slid coldly over the crowd, but no one responded. Silence had become judgment. The officers moved with practiced precision. One disarmed him, the other cuffed his hands behind his back. Hasker froze, as if only now realizing he was never allowed to draw a gun at a military funeral. But that moment passed. Head held high, eyes locking with Monroe's, he spat through clenched teeth. "I know who you are. I know exactly." No one replied. She didn't need to. With hands cuffed behind him, Hasker now resembled a hollow statue, stone intact on the outside but emptied at the core. Escorted out of the cemetery, he passed through the heaviest silence anyone could imagine. No boos, no applause, no pity. The crowd remained still, not in shock, but burdened by collective shame, each silently asking, "Why didn't we stop this sooner?" Monroe stayed where she was, urn still in hand, gaze fixed on the casket. The shattered photograph lay nearby, the glass cracked, the frame chipped, but the young soldier's smile remained untouched. No one moved to retrieve it, not out of fear, but because they were learning how to face the consequences of silence. An old man in the front row, white-haired, with hunched shoulders, World War II insignia pinned proudly on his chest, slowly rose with the help of his cane. He didn't speak at first. He simply walked to the center aisle, where Hasker had been, and struck his cane sharply 3 times against the stone floor. Each blow echoed sharply, reverberating in the hearts of those who heard it like a call to remembrance. Then he spoke, his voice raspy and blunt as if resurrected from the trenches of the past. "Today morality turns a page." No applause followed. Instead, heads bowed, not to him, but to the truth just spoken. A truth that could not be taken back, denied, or forgotten. The faces in the crowd resembled shards of broken glass, each reflecting something different. Some flushed with shame, some shut their eyes tight, others tried to maintain composure. But everyone understood. All who were present had in some way helped create a moment that could never be washed clean. 1 second, just 1 second. That was all it took to draw a weapon in a place meant only for flags, ceremonial drums, and a family's grief. No one mentioned suspension. No one uttered mistake. No official promised an investigation, because the truth had already unfolded right before their eyes, with cameras, witnesses, and, most chillingly, under the unwavering gaze of hundreds bound by military honor. A gun was drawn at a funeral. A police officer was escorted out like a saboteur. And a general, without raising a hand or uttering a word, stood still, forcing the system to confront itself. There was nothing left to say. The ceremony resumed. The honor guard adjusted its formation. A senior officer replaced the broken photograph with a new frame, brought from the auxiliary funeral hall. Every motion followed the original script. But the event was no longer the same. Not because time had slowed, but because faith in what was sacred had cracked. And that crack didn't come from a bullet. It came from permission. The quiet consent that allowed someone like Hasker to rise to a place where he could draw a gun and not be stopped. The mother with the son in the miniature uniform remained still. The boy asked no more questions, but his hand clenched tighter in hers, crumpling a fold in the mourning flag resting across her lap. Perhaps what he learned that day wouldn't come from textbooks, but from the way no one spoke when something so profoundly wrong occurred. The funeral continued. The drums sounded 3 times. The honor shots rang out, precise, cold, slicing through the silence like blades. But what lingered wasn't the ritual. It was what had happened before. What must never happen again. 1 second. To draw a gun. 1 second. To lose everything. 1 second. To reveal just how rotten a system had become. By giving someone like Hasker that much power. But it also took 1 second. For someone like Monroe to stand firm. and forced the entire system to choose complicity or reckoning. A single second to expose the truth. And less than 6 hours later, America awoke with one question on everyone's lips. Who is she? Her name, rank, face, and entire military record began surfacing like an unstoppable undertow, not because the media uncovered it, but because the very system that once tried to bury her now had no choice but to lay it bare. Elise Monroe, the General of the United States Army, was not just any officer. She was the first black female commander in history to hold operational control over 3 strategic combat units. The woman who had a gun pointed at her during a military funeral was no intruder, no unnamed guest. She was the very leader who had orchestrated the daring rescue of 18 American soldiers from a rebel prison camp in Kandahar. Among those saved was the son of a Virginia state senator, one who had long spoken out against diversity in the armed forces. A powerful photograph emerged the next morning, splashed across the front page of the New York Times. It showed Monroe kneeling under gunfire, bandaging the leg of a panicked private during that operation. The headline blazed. A general was held at gunpoint. Yet it was America itself on trial. No sensationalism was needed. The stark facts alone sent chills through the nation. Monroe's record spoke for itself. She had led a rapid infantry battalion through 5 anti-terror missions across the Syrian border. She was the sole survivor of an ambush in Iraq, returning with 3 wounded soldiers carried on her back. According to leaked Defense Department records, she had twice declined promotions to administrative Pentagon roles, choosing instead to remain in ground command. Her name quickly spread across Twitter, Reddit, and military forums, but not as a political symbol. No one debated her ideology or party lines. They asked only one question. How could this happen to someone like her? And why did no one stop it? The hashtag #FuneralGunGate surged to the top worldwide within hours. A veteran wrote, "I've never seen my military disgraced like this, and I've never seen a general endure such humiliation with such honor." A female war correspondent who had accompanied Monroe in Mosul described her as the only person she'd ever seen who could step over a corpse and still remind her troops why they carry weapons. Not everyone agreed. A conservative senator, known for opposing gender integration and special operations, publicly defended Hasker's protocol verification, claiming any threat to national security must be taken seriously, no matter who was involved. But his argument unraveled quickly. When his own son, a Navy officer stationed in Hawaii, tweeted at midnight, "Dad, that woman pulled me out of a minefield in Afghanistan. Stop defending the indefensible." The tweet went viral, shared nearly 1 million times in hours. The incident pieced itself together. General Dana, a nation long accustomed to power, forced to relearn what honor truly means. International press weighed in. CNN called it a slap in the face of American pride. The Guardian described the funeral as a surreal portrait of political battlefield and personal dignity. Yet everything circled back to one question, heard across platforms and perspectives. Who is she? That evening, a veteran news anchor opened primetime television with words no one expected. There are those who hold rank, and there are those who are rank. Elise Monroe doesn't need stars on her shoulder. She makes the entire system bow just by standing still. Monroe gave no speeches, no press releases. She didn't appear on talk shows or give interviews. Those close to her knew it wasn't fear. It was understanding. Everything that needed to be said was already spoken. In the moment she chose not to retreat, not to resist, not to step back when faced with a gun. The greatest reply a soldier can offer is not firing back, but holding fast to principles even under threat from someone wearing the same badge. The military community responded. Quietly, a senior veterans association sent an open letter to the Department of Defense demanding a full review of selection and promotion criteria for Joint Task Force officers. Its opening line read, "If someone like Monroe cannot be recognized even in the heart of a military cemetery, then we must examine our eyes, our hearts, and our conscience." That same day, major military bases across the country held emergency forums on ritual power and moral thresholds. A West Point cadet interviewed afterward simply said, "I don't know if I could have done what she did, but if I had been there, I would not have stayed silent." Monroe's story moved far beyond a single incident. He became a symbol, not glorified, but undeniable, because no one could deny the raw truth captured in every second of that video. Her calmness, her grip on the urn, the way she stared unflinchingly into the face of a gun. No act was staged. I'll give you one word: forced. That was why it transcended incident. It became a mirror. Mirror no one wants to see, but none can turn away from. Elise Monroe's name no longer needs rank, no longer needs unit verification. It has become a question turned inward. Why did it take a gun pointed at her face for someone like her to be truly seen? Her silence lasted exactly 36 hours. No statement, no public appearance, no signal. While the nation debated whether she would speak up as a hero or retreat as a victim, she submitted a single document to the Federal Department of Justice. "I will testify as a witness, not a victim." No embellishments, no legal team, no spokesperson, just one sentence. Yet it ignited the next phase. The law had to speak. Within 6 hours, the Department of Justice responded. A press release appeared on the government portal. No press conference, no emotion, only words, cold and precise as a blade. The incident involving the unwarranted use of armed force by a police officer within a national military ceremonial zone is under investigation for violation of human rights and desecration of a national military site. The hearing will be made public. Only 25 lines. Only 3 paragraphs. But the key phrases rang like alarms: unwarranted force, violation of human rights, desecration of national military. For the first time, a police officer was not merely investigated for overreach in a civilian setting. He faced federal prosecution within the most sacred space of national service, an act deemed not just legally wrong but sacrilegious. Within the military, the response was no less intense. Leaked emails from the Joint Chiefs revealed more than 35 active generals signed a petition demanding a public trial before the national press. Their stated purpose not to protect an individual but to defend the moral boundaries of the entire force. In a private letter sent directly to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, a retired 4-star general wrote, "No one who has ever served under Monroe would misunderstand what is being tested here. This is no longer about personal honor, it's about the legitimacy of a nation." Meanwhile, the opposing side began to assemble its defense. Robert Hasker, after several quiet days in custody, publicly selected a notorious but familiar defense attorney, the same lawyer who had represented defendants in the January Capitol riot. In his first press conference, this lawyer offered no apologies, no attempts at reconciliation. Instead, he declared bluntly, "My client acted in his duty. Any exercise of authority is justified if security is perceived to be at risk, and no one can prove he did not feel threatened." It was a dangerous argument, razor sharp but not defending the action itself, only the feeling behind it. In a nation where personal emotions increasingly justified behavior, it was a double-edged sword. Deadly and unpredictable, public opinion quickly split. Yet the veteran community issued a rare and powerful response. A coalition of more than 60 veteran organizations sent an open letter to Congress and the Department of Justice titled, "Do Not Turn Justice into a Political Rehearsal." The letter read, "We do not care what party Monroe belongs to. We care that a military funeral was turned into a site of rank desecration. If that is not enough to force the system to reconsider itself, then the system has forfeited its right to exist." Tension soared further when a leak video surfaced from inside the state police department, verified footage from a security team briefing held before the funeral. In less than 1 minute, a voice believed to be Hasker's rang out clearly and unedited, "Listen to me. If any colored person tries to get into the ceremonial line without being on the list, I'll teach them a lesson right there in the cemetery, so they know where the line is." The video spread like wildfire, and within 3 hours the Attorney General was summoned for a special press briefing in Washington. He did not read a prepared statement or cite legal theory. Instead, he spoke one sentence with chilling clarity. "I don't care who the person with the gun pointed at them was. I care why the person holding the gun thought they had the right to do it." Public outcry exploded. The media scrambled, but Monroe remained silent. No press interviews, no statements, no defense. The only person to contact her during the 3-day investigation was the Assistant United States Attorney. According to their account, Monroe said only one thing: "I did not come to be defended. I came to see how justice shapes itself when there is no threat attached." The official indictment was announced at the preliminary hearing. Hasker faced 5 counts: use of a weapon in a federally protected ceremonial zone, racially motivated threat, abuse of authority, obstruction of military rights, and desecration of the dignity of a national service member. The last charge carries a maximum sentence of life imprisonment without parole. Subsequent hearings were ordered to be public. Federal Courtroom Number 3 in Washington, D.C. was designated for the proceedings. The entire investigation record was to remain intact and unaltered. Most importantly, no individual, not even politicians, would be allowed to interfere with the jury. The law was no longer a choice, it had become a duty, not just to punish, but to make one thing crystal clear: the honor of someone in uniform cannot be threatened at gunpoint and then soothed with a late apology. The indictment ink had barely dried. News articles still fresh off the press. Courtroom Number 3 had yet to open its doors. But somewhere far from juries, statutes, and streams of heated tweets, a letter was sent. It was handwritten in blue ink on plain white paper. No government letterhead, no official emblem, no legal certification. It came from a small town on the outskirts of Missouri. From the mother of the soldier who died at that funeral, living alone. "My son died for America," she wrote, "but America didn't keep its promise to him. Not even at his funeral." It wasn't an accusation. It carried no anger, only soft, piercing clarity. The words were sharp as a needle, pointing where no one wanted to look. Her name was Ruth Darnell. Her son was Sergeant Mason Darnell, killed during his 3rd deployment on the Syrian border in a midnight ambush when his unit lost contact with command. Posthumously awarded the Purple Heart, his funeral had been held at Arlington with full military honors, until a gun that should never have been there appeared. Ruth's letter was brief, just 2 pages, but shared millions of times on social media, read aloud by dozens of journalists on national television, not for literary flourish, but because of one final line that shook the nation to its core. He once told me, "If I die, ask General Monroe to say a few words for me." And in the end, they didn't even let her come near my son's body. That simple sentence was enough. Within 6 hours of the letter's release, a close friend of Mason's from the same unit shared a page from his combat diary, handwritten, stained with sand and sweat. In it, Mason wrote, "If something happens to me, I hope Ms. Monroe delivers the eulogy. Doesn't have to be long. Just her voice." Hearing her voice over gunfire is what kept me from panicking. No script could capture that depth of feeling. No one could justify pointing a gun at Monroe as she approached the casket. The following day, at St. Mary's Church in Georgia, where the Darnell family had worshipped for 3 generations, a prayer service was held, not to mourn the dead, but to preserve the honor still alive. Outside the church, a banner hung, handwritten in bold brown cursive. "We pray for the values that once were the backbone of this nation, not to recover them, but so we do not forget." There were no news cameras, no prestigious guests. Just around 40 people, mostly aging veterans, kneeling quietly in wooden pews reciting prayers. No one mentioned Monroe's name. No one condemned anyone. But in their eyes was a silent consensus. This time it must not be allowed to pass like all the others. After the service, Father Reuben Ellis, 64, was invited to bless the local police department. He declined, not in anger or protest, but with a single line in an email. I cannot bless a place that once pointed a gun at honor. A small gesture. But in the world of faith, it was a withdrawal of grace. A bell that rang without being struck. Public outrage had evolved. No longer mass hysteria or outrage. It became a slow, deep, irreversible current. Veteran groups across the country began quietly organizing gatherings, not to debate policies, but to talk about dignity. An old soldier in New Mexico recounted, "I've seen comrades die of thirst in the desert, but I've never seen a general forbidden from approaching her soldier." The matter had grown far beyond a mere lawsuit. It had become a generational reckoning, a generation long silenced by fear of complexity and the repeated mantra, "This too shall pass." But this time they had waited too long to let it pass again. Those present at the funeral, the living witnesses, began writing letters by hand, not as legal complaints but as observation journals. One mother documented every expression on her son's face when the gun was drawn. A military medic recorded the irregular blood pressure readings of elderly veterans seated behind her as they watched the scene unfold, line by line, detail by detail, not dramatic or sensational, but sharper than any piece of evidence. Academics called it the phenomenon of slow, accumulated moral reaction, when a society long used to closing its eyes is suddenly forced to open them, not by choice, but because honor was no longer theoretical. It was now inside an urn that was denied its rightful place. On forums for black service members, a new slogan spread, "We've been waiting for so long, no explanation was needed. Anyone who ever wore the uniform understood." It wasn't a demand, it was an indictment. Of patience stretched to the breaking point. The silence surrounding Robert Hasker was short-lived. Those who aim weapons at honor often leave traces behind. And though the system once covered those traces, once looked away, when forced to confront itself, it follows those traces like dried blood on cold stone. 7 days after the official indictment, internal personnel files from the state police department where Hasker served for 13 years were leaked. Among the dense stack of documents was one particular complaint handwritten by Hasker himself in 2012. The slanted handwriting was addressed to Personnel Command of Military District 7 at Fort Bragg. The reason for rejection? Not physical standards, but political factors. Underlined 3 times in red ink was, "An accusation. This unit tends to favor black soldiers." The author was a 29-year-old Robert J. Hasker, recently disqualified from the enlistment list for failing the initial psychological screening. In his letter, he argued he met all physical requirements, had no criminal record, and was motivated to serve. His exclusion, he claimed, was based on alleged emotional instability under pressure. But the most notable part lay in a handwritten note scrawled in the bottom margin. "If someone like me isn't allowed to serve, then people like them don't deserve to be called soldiers." In 2012, no one read that letter, or rather, no one wanted to acknowledge it. But when the Arlington incident erupted, people traced it back to its roots. And those roots did not come from clerical error. They emerged from deliberate ideology. A man denied honor who weaponized rejection against those who were granted it. In a 2018 interview for a documentary series titled Perspectives from the Keepers of the Streets, Hasker said, "I can't live in a world where people wear ranks they don't deserve. When you realize you're losing, but losing to a rigged game, breaking the rules isn't wrong anymore, it becomes inevitable." When the host asked what he meant, Hasker answered without hesitation, "If I weren't chosen to be among them, then I'll be the one guarding the gate." At the time, few grasped the gravity of that statement, but framed by what happened at Arlington, the gun, the look he gave Monroe, it became clear. He was never merely a protocol officer. He was a man who believed his rightful place was stolen and sought to reclaim it by aiming a gun at someone who embodied honor far beyond his reach. A 2012 military psychological assessment concluded with one line, "Candidate displays signs of a damaged value system, exhibits uncontrollable responses when encountering individuals who surpass his criteria." Not a diagnosis, not a disorder, but a self-suggested narrative of stolen superiority. He didn't hate because he lost. He hated because he believed the winner had taken a false route. False in the eyes of a man whose internal scale had long rusted from unearned pride. Following the indictment, investigators searched Hasker's residence and found a small, worn leather notebook. It contained no notes except 4 words written in red ink, sealed at the back. "I will take back." No date, no recipient. The handwriting matched the final line of the rejected enlistment complaint from years earlier. Behavioral analysts saw in this no impulsive outburst but a smoldering vow, nurtured by resentment, fed by hatred, and driven by a need to define oneself by stripping others of their rightful identity. Those who once worked alongside Hasker began speaking, not publicly, not to media, but enough to paint a clearer picture. An officer on patrol during Hasker's first year recalled he rarely spoke, but whenever the commanding officer was black, he'd come back mumbling, "These days, if you know how to talk politics, you climb faster than a bullet." Every past remark, every forgotten document became evidence, not to excuse, but to clarify. This was not a man pushed into error. This was a man who traveled a long road, waiting for his chance to strike. And that chance, bitter irony, came in a cemetery. Monday morning, federal courtroom number 3. No one spoke, no one adjusted their tie, no one dared glance at their phone, not even once. Everyone sat upright, as if this place held not only a judge's eyes but the gaze of an entire nation, peering into a mirror never wiped clean. The face of justice, unpainted, uncosted. This time, leaving no room for evasion, Elise Monroe walked in, not for show, not posing, not seeking cameras. She walked like someone who had once stepped over scorched sands, crossed enemy lines, and advanced through crossfire without waiting for a signal. Her uniform was crisp. The 4-star insignia on her left shoulder gleamed under the bright white lights. Her medals were worn in full, not to claim glory, but to underline the only order still intact in a country growing blurry between symbol and substance. What is paid for in blood, no one has the right to rewrite with words. She raised her hand to swear in, her gaze unwavering. The clerk read her name, age, and rank. No one blinked. When invited to sit, Monroe spoke softly, clearly, without prompting. "I will stand." Her voice wasn't loud, but it filled the entire room with unmistakable resolve. Today she had no intention of sitting down, in a courtroom where injustice had long since stood. As an attorney stepped forward, a man in his 50s, dark suit, sunken eyes, a thin smile like a hidden blade. He didn't start with questions. He stared at Monroe like a finely tuned marketing piece, then opened with an unsolicited remark. "Ma'am, today you wear your uniform. Is that to make people forget you're the one who was hurt?" Monroe did not respond immediately. Her eyes were neither angry nor tolerant. They simply held steady, clear, and unyielding. She straightened her posture, squared her shoulders, and said softly, "I wear this uniform because the one I want to speak of no longer lives to wear it." The lawyer raised his eyebrows. "Then tell me, General, are you here today as a witness or as a political symbol?" He emphasized symbol as if it were a stain, not an honor. The courtroom fell silent, not out of surprise, but because everyone understood that question lay at the heart of America's divide. Monroe locked eyes with him, unblinking. Slowly she unbuttoned the left side of her jacket and pulled out a small box, placing it gently on the witness stand. She stared. "A Purple Heart Medal," she said, her voice steady as before, "awarded by the President in a ceremony without media, without speeches, without cameras. I have bled. I've nearly died. I left part of my body behind in a place no one dared fly over, and I do not need pity." The attorney sat down, unable to counter. He scribbled in his notebook, but everyone knew no words could dull the red on that medal, or the answer forged over a lifetime of service. The judge gave a subtle nod. "Miss Monroe, you may proceed with your statement." No further prompting was needed. Elise did not glance at notes or read from a script. She spoke as though each word had been carved into her spine. "I did not come here to list the battles I've fought. I came because someone thought they had the right to draw a gun in the middle of a sacred ceremony aimed at the person who once commanded the unit that kept American soldiers alive in enemy territory." She paused, leaving no room for interruption. Then she continued, "I had been ambushed by the Taliban. I'd lost part of my arm to a landmine, but I had never had a gun pointed at me until I wore my uniform on American soil." For 2 long seconds, the courtroom sank into a heavy silence, not from sentimentality, but because no one could look away. No one could pretend it was just a line. No one dared say, "I didn't know this happened." A juror, the only white woman on the panel, drew in a long breath. Not from fear or discomfort, but because she realized she wasn't being asked to judge right from wrong. She was being asked to decide whether America still had enough honor left to call this justice. Asker's attorney rose again, his tone no longer mocking but still razor sharp. "And what do you say to those who claim you're being used as a symbol, that justice is being swayed by emotion?" Monroe tilted her head, unshaken and unoffended. She asked calmly, "What emotion?" "The public's anger," he replied. She nodded. "If the public is angry, then they are angry for me, because I do not have time to be angry. I am too busy standing still. So they don't have to bow before a system that has already collapsed." No one spoke further. No one needed to. Because in this courtroom there would be no victor. Only one thing remained standing, the truth. And that truth, wearing a uniform, bearing scars, carrying a medal, stood tall. She looked straight ahead, waiting for no permission to be named. The courtroom no longer echoed with coughs. Not even the clicking of cameras. Even the rustling of the clerk's papers seemed swallowed by the thickening air rising by the second. Every ounce of attention converged on one point. 2 individuals standing less than 4 steps apart. One wore a uniform, spine straight, hands free. The other wore a prison jumpsuit, wrists cuffed, eyes devoid of remorse, replaced only by the hardened dullness forged from long-standing resentment. The court called out. Confrontation between defendant Robert James Hasker and witness General Elise Monroe commenced. No one spoke. Hasker stood, collar twisted, a crooked smile slanting to the left corner of his lips, as if this confrontation were the performance he'd waited a lifetime to deliver. He spoke first. "I don't know who trained you," his voice steady, each word drawn slowly like a sharpened blade. "But I know one thing. Someone who's seen real combat doesn't flinch at the sight of a Glock, especially when it hasn't fired." Monroe did not reply. She did not resist. She did not need to. Her gaze moved slowly, not toward his face, but toward a folded map placed before the witness stand. She opened it, not hastily, but with enough finality that every eye followed each crease. An aged map unfolded, not a reprint for military minds, but an original tactical chart of Afghanistan, edges worn by rain, dust, and time. She pointed to a spot in the Kunduz desert, marked with 3 concentric red circles. "I was ambushed here that year. I led a joint unit, lost contact with headquarters for 3 days. No reinforcements, no satellite signal, but I still got 6 people out." She paused, looked up. One of those 6 was a son of Senator Kramer, who, I've been told, once advocated against prosecuting you. No applause, no gasps, but a moral tremor, wordless, struck the collective chest of the courtroom. Truth does not need a microphone to echo. Hasker gave a faint chuckle, head tilting slightly to the right. "So you can shoot," he said, tone like glass scraping metal, "but you can't stand to have a gun pointed at you. How amusing." A few in the room held their breath. Not because the remark was profound, but because the shamelessness breached the limits of human decency. Monroe did not react. She looked directly forward. No flinching, no movement. 3 seconds passed. Then she spoke, not in anger, but naming a wound once hers. "I don't refuse being targeted. I refuse to bow." That sentence was no strike. It was a verdict, not aimed at the man standing before her, but at anyone who ever believed honor could be crushed by nothing more than a curled finger on a trigger. Hasker's lawyer began to rise, but the judge's sharp glance stopped him. No further defense was needed. Hasker's presence, the way he looked at the woman who once saved the child of the man protecting him, had confessed everything necessary. Monroe wasn't finished. She walked slowly toward the evidence podium and pulled from her pocket a printed copy of the 2012 complaint, the very document Hasker submitted when dejected from military enlistment. She held it up and said, "This is the only thing that surprised me in this entire case." Turning her gaze to the jury, she added, "He didn't draw his weapon because he saw me as a threat. He drew it because he didn't believe I deserved to wear the uniform, something he never qualified to put on." Her voice wasn't loud, but it was complete and piercing. For the first time since the confrontation began, she looked directly at Hasker. Neither contempt nor anger softened her tone. Softly, she said, "That wasn't just a gun. It was a hand that never had the right to hold it." No one dared move. No one could continue to see the defendant as just an individual. Hasker no longer represented mere misconduct. He embodied a harsher truth, that some enter the system not to protect it, but to weaponize it against those who make them feel inferior. Monroe bowed slightly, not in submission, but as a soldier completing her field report. Then she stepped down from the stand, never looking back, needing no validation. The only validation she required was the truth, laid bare in a place once thought too constrained by technicalities to breathe. The confrontation ended. No one won. No one clapped. But one thing became clearer than ever. This was no longer a trial of the man who pulled the trigger. It was the trial of those who refused to look in the mirror. Hasker entered the system not by honor but driven by hunger to become someone others feared. He was never a symbol of competence or a role model among peers. But he knew how to survive, how to slip through cracks in a flawed system, how to turn the disdain he harbored into armor, not to hide himself, but to make others hesitate before exposing him. Throughout the trial, media spotlight clung tightly to the showdown between Hasker and Monroe. But once the lights dimmed, newsrooms began digging through dust deliberately buried. What surfaced was no rogue individual breaking rules, but a system that waved him through, cloaked in notoriety. A leaked video from Randolph Elementary School in North Carolina, dated 2016, exploded across social media overnight. In the 2.5-minute clip, Hasker, then serving as a liaison security officer, was seen restraining a 10-year-old black boy. The child lay face down on the playground pavement, hands bound with plastic zip ties, crying out. Hasker shouted, "This one's wandering, refuses to identify, not allowed to move." His voice was dry, devoid of logic. He nudged the boy's leg with his boot, sneered, and spoke into his radio. "One subject attempting to breach restricted zone. Request residential verification." The official report concluded it was handled according to protocol. The case was closed in just 3 days. Not long after, a female officer who had worked directly under Hasker appeared on CNN, testifying, "He once slapped me in the elevator because I didn't stand at attention when he spoke." For safety, her identity remained undisclosed. She provided a copy of an internal complaint filed with the department's inspection board. But the file was gone, marked "missing, unable to verify." That was the moment she left the force, and the last time she wore the uniform. The final blow came from an often overlooked source, the Jackson Dispatch. An amateur journalist unearthed a decade's worth of internal personnel review logs from the state police. Hasker's name appeared 8 times, linked to violations ranging from racially charged remarks and coercive behavior to tampering with security cameras. Each case was resolved with the phrases "counseled" or "insufficient evidence." No one called it protection. But no one believed it coincidence. On the very night the story aired, a white man with silver hair and a thick Southern accent appeared on national television. "My name is George Millstone," he said. "I used to be Robert Hasker's direct superior." Without preamble, his gaze met the cameras. "I'd improved keeping him on after 3 complaints because I thought a few rough edges weren't enough to dismiss someone who could keep order. Now I realize by not removing him I greenlit a moral execution." Not everyone was convinced. Some politicians cited incomplete procedures. Right-healing outlets defended the right to self-defense. But truth doesn't wait for consensus. It only needs exposure. Once exposed, it never hides again. A special consolidated report from the Federal Commission on Executive Ethics confirmed what many feared. Robert James Hasker was no isolated incident. He was a repeated product of a permissive system, where records disappeared, witnesses were silenced, authority entrusted to hands that never knew how to hold it. No one stepped forward to accept collective responsibility. No institution issued an apology with a name attached. But one truth blazed clear. Hasker was never a mistake. He was the precise symptom of a sequence of wrong decisions dressed as order. Now, in court, he no longer smiled, no longer looked at Monroe with defiance. His face had stiffened, not from fear of sentencing, but because every act he once shielded with coarse language and aggression was now returning in the only form he could not endure. Truth fell, not by verdict or public opinion, but by fragments of evidence. Stories once discarded. Details everyone saw but no one spoke of until silence broke. And as the shadow of a man stripped bare staggered before the bench, hundreds more shadows began to emerge. Not in suits, not as scholars, but as soldiers. No one invited them. No one organized. No media teams. No hashtags. But on the 9th day of the trial, as the jury entered deliberation, over 100 black veterans signed a 4-page declaration. It began with a simple line. We once kept quiet not because we didn't know, but because we believed someone else would speak for us. But if Elise Monroe is not protected, then none of us has any value left. The declaration made no pleas for forgiveness. It offered no accusations. It simply spoke through the battlefield experiences of those who had survived alongside Monroe, breathed the same air, and witnessed not only how she commanded, but how much dignity she preserved where death was the only equalizer. Sergeant Glenn Porter, now retired, who served with Monroe in Helmand Province in 2010, wrote, "She was the first to jump from the vehicle when the mine exploded and the last to leave the rally point after carrying every wounded soldier out. The only time I ever bowed my head to a superior was not because of her rank, but because she held the dignity of our entire unit in the exact moment I thought I had nothing left to hold on to." No one reads that line without feeling their throat tighten. Not because Monroe was deified, but because those who lived at the edge of death confirmed she was among the rare few who did not turn power into a pedestal, but into a shield for others. In southern Florida, a soldier suffering from PTSD who fought in the same Kandahar mission sat before a local news camera. His face bore the marks of trauma, but his gaze was sharp as glass. "My daughter keeps asking me, who's an ideal role model? I never named a princess," he said. "I said Monroe, not because she's perfect, but because when I broke down in the rubble, she pulled me out without even asking who I was." No music bed, no dramatics. These testimonies carried their own weight. In a courtroom trying to draw lines between honor and entitlement, such voices became the foundation no one could dismiss. The final story, and the anchor of the declaration, came from a former Navy SEAL who had never before appeared in media. In a handwritten letter 3 paragraphs long, he wrote, "I had been wounded in the leg. Monroe bandaged me right at the outpost. When I came to, I told her straight, I don't want to be saved by a woman. She just looked at me. Didn't get angry, didn't smile, didn't reply, but her hand never let go of my leg until the medics arrived. Today I write this not to make amends, but to say this. The person I once insulted is the only one I owe my life to. They called Monroe cold. They called her the Iron Woman. But these stories don't describe her with words. They build her like bricks, raw, rough, chipped, but stacked so firmly no one could shake them. No need for ornament. No need for slogans. She wasn't protected by reputation. She was surrounded by those she had lifted off battlefields. The media reported it, but they didn't color it. Neutral outlets condemned the system. Conservative outlets couldn't ignore it. Because this time the ones speaking weren't journalists or attorneys. They were soldiers, those who once held each other's lives by threats of blood, and now held justice by stories no one else could rewrite. The letter ended with a single line, not polished like a slogan, but firm like a period closing a chapter. If justice does not stand with Monroe, then it has already fallen. The trial entered its 13th day. The wooden benches of the courtroom no longer held mere spectators. They had become rows of history. Every small movement, averted eyes, stammered testimony, trembling hands, carried the power to strike at the very system each person struggled to keep upright. But this was no place for balance. Truth by nature requires no balance. It only needs to be spoken. The first to take the stand was Lieutenant Frederick Hale, a white police officer who worked directly with Hasker for 6 years in the administrative unit. His record was clean, his performance average. But when asked, "Were you ever instructed to ignore Hasker's misconduct?" he froze. 3 seconds, then 5. A dry swallow. Then his voice shattered the courtroom like a pane of glass struck dead center by a hammer. "We were ordered to look away." If this story moved you, please like, comment, and subscribe. Your support helps give light to voices that deserve to be seen and heard. The room exploded into silence. No one seated nearby dared move. No one on the legal team interrupted, because that answer was no mere testimony. It was a systemic confession. The judge called for document citations. An internal memo dated November 18, 2021, titled "Unstable Behavior Report on Officer Hasker" was read aloud. The line in the center of the page stood out like an unhealed scar. "Hasker is dangerous but useful. Keep him under control." No attorney needed to underline it. The system had spoken for itself. Immediately after, the prosecution requested release of additional materials, including internal messages between unit commanders. After debate, the judge permitted disclosure of 3 message threads. The shortest was a single text from the duty captain to a subordinate, sent 3 days before the funeral. "Let him rough up the brass if he wants to. It'll keep them in line." The courtroom froze. No one shouted. They didn't have to. Every word and punctuation mark struck their hearts like a gavel striking a verdict not yet announced. They knew. They chose to stay silent. Then something unprecedented in state law enforcement history occurred. From the gallery, State Police Commissioner James O'Connor stepped forward. He had not been subpoenaed. He wasn't on the witness list. But he stood tall, eyes heavy as if bearing a sack of stones tied to his chest. He spoke. "I request to address the court, not as an official, but as a man who allowed a broken system to continue existing." The entire courtroom held its breath. O'Connor did not look at Monroe, nor at Hasker. He looked only at the jury. "I read the reports. I saw the complaints. I approved letting them stay buried in a drawer. And because of that, I do not ask for forgiveness. I only ask that everyone see this clearly. It was not one officer who drew a weapon. It was an entire system that loaded the chamber. The courtroom had yet to settle from the violent confrontation when the left door opened. No one spoke. No one signaled. But everyone knew. It was his turn. Hasker stood. No bow. No remorse. His suit pressed perfectly, as if freshly tailored for a political gala, not a federal holding cell. His steps neither rushed nor hesitant. Each step was a challenge, not to the court, but to the very definition of order the trial was supposed to uphold. No one stopped him. No one dared. Hasker scanned the room, stripping layers off every face, not with a knife, but with the cruel precision of someone once at the heart of power. Then he stood tall, hands uncuffed, unrestrained. An attorney moved to remind him of procedural limits, but then paused, not out of fear, but because any warning now would sound ridiculous. "You want me to tell the truth," Hasker began, voice level, lacking theatrics, grinding out each syllable like a groan in a hypocrite's throat. "Fine, then listen closely. I'm not the monster you've sculpted for your television dramas. I'm not your ideal villain for the system to hang its guilt on. I am your most perfect product, born of promoted silence, of ethics programmed to dodge reality. The room was so quiet that the unconscious tapping of a juror's fingernail on the wooden armrest echoed like a metronome. Hasker stared directly into their eyes, the people chosen to represent justice, and spoke with a syrupy venom, like a serpent coiling. Dr. Banks, would you be so kind as to don't sit there pretending to be righteous. I only did what you all think about but never dare say. I signed off on detaining black men without evidence because it balanced the numbers. I approved budgets for juvenile detention because it secured my next election. I know this machine runs on silent consent, and I was just the one with the guts to name it. A female reporter dropped her pen. Her hands shook, unsure if from fury or the crushing realization that she had once quoted him without challenge. Juror number 9, an older man in a blue suit, furrowed his brow, caught in that strange line between truth and revulsion. "Don't tell me I'm wrong," Hasker snapped, seeing heads begin to shake. "When you've been silent for decades, don't pretend to be shocked when a child is stripped and interrogated in a precinct and the press says nothing, when a mother is deported for missing a medical appointment. Where were you? Where were you, ha?" His voice roused, not like a man losing control, but like one who knows exactly when to drive the blade deeper into the heart of moral pretense. No one could meet his gaze anymore. Hasker turned toward the jury box, faces cracking, some filled with hatred, others disgust. But the most vulnerable was the man in the back row, bowed, hand covering his mouth, shoulders shaking violently as a sob escaped into the dead air. Hasker sneered, lip curling with wicked delight. "Looks like I hit the pus pocket." His voice dripped with triumphant malice. "If I'm going to prison, then this America is coming with me, not because I'm a hero, but because I'm a mirror warped by your evasive glances, your callous clicks, and all the times you chose silence to protect your pretty little reputations." The juror wept. Not for Hasker, but because part of what he said echoed a private dread, a dread born from voting blank on discriminatory bills, from ignoring misconduct reports, from saying, "I don't have enough information to object." And today, in this room, that silence was being ripped open, not by truth, but by a man dragging society into the mud with him. The judge moved to interrupt, but Hasker raised a hand, not signaling, just holding it up quietly like a cult priest offering benediction. He didn't need more time. He had already sewn collapse into every crack of the courtroom's mask of justice. "You can sentence me to 10 years, 20, maybe life," he hissed through clenched teeth. "But remember, when you condemn me, you also condemn the myth that we are better than our past. No, you're not better, you're just better at covering it up." The cameraman's hand trembled, throwing the frame off axis. The broadcast director cursed, not at the technical glitch, but because no one dared cut the feed. Social media exploded. The hashtag "I am guilty" surged like mushrooms after rain, not in support of Hasker, but as proof that he had cracked the most fragile wall of all, the belief that, at least, I'm not part of the problem. "Yes," he exhaled, "I am guilty, but I'm not alone, and that's why I'll sleep better than you tonight." No one clapped. No one spoke. But everyone knew he hadn't asked for forgiveness. He had cursed the room with the most venomous benediction possible. The final silence belonged not to the victor, but to the one who failed, yet managed to bring the tower down with nothing but his voice. In that moment, those who remained in the courtroom, repulsed, enraged, or afraid, had to admit the mask had fallen. No one was innocent. No one remained unstained. No one would leave wearing white. The room had yet to catch its breath after Hasker's final words, when the slow, steady clack of the clerk's shoes echoed like the wooden drum of a funeral ritual. No cue, no command, but everyone knew the moment of judgment had arrived. Not a single camera trembled. Not a whisper, not a gasp, The entire courtroom felt held in someone's palm, not by force, but by a silence willingly offered as sacrifice. The jury foreman rose. The paper in his hand did not shake, but his eyes, despite decades within the legal system, could not hide their fracture. He did not look at anyone, not the defendant, not Monroe, not his fellow jurors. He stared straight ahead, into an invisible void, as though reading a farewell to an era once thought untouchable. We, the jury of the people, after thorough review of all evidence, testimonies, and public trial proceedings, sentenced the defendant Robert L. Hasker to life imprisonment without parole. No screams, no sobs, no fists slammed, no applause. Only one sound cut through, louder than any judgment ever handed down. Laughter. A rough, cracked, violent laugh that made the courtroom air shrink away from itself. Hasker laughed. Not the laugh of a defeated man. Not the laugh of madness. He laughed, as if at last the world had admitted what he'd always known. It had been a tragic farce, and now the curtain had finally fallen. He stood, slowly, unaided, eyes sharp like an old blade, rusted but still sharp enough to cut flesh. His gaze swept across everyone who had once sat in judgment of him. In the end, guns don't kill, he spat, each word like blood coughed into the air. But fear kills everyone. No one replied. No one knew how to answer something so true and so vile at the same time. Those who believed justice to be solid had to watch it tremble in the hands of the man just convicted. And it was that trembling, not the sentence, that became the real judgment. Overall stood. No one moved. The courtroom seemed frozen by a truth no one dared name. The criminal had been sentenced, but the stains he dragged remained untouched. People bowed their heads, not in grief nor respect, but as one does at a funeral, not for a person, but for an illusion once built from laws, lectures, and honorary degrees. Monroe remained seated. Her eyes faced forward, though not on Hasker. Her gaze was light, deep, and far away, as if reaching beyond the room, toward something more important. An unfinished memory. In the back row, a boy around 8 sat silently. The same boy who had asked her at the funeral, "What is that man doing?" That innocent question had become the real verdict for society, because it didn't demand justice. It had asked what justice even meant. Monroe turned her head, just for a moment, not to answer, but so the boy would understand. Some things need no reply. Actions are the only true response. In that fleeting instant their eyes met, forming a quiet pact. Truth isn't what people declare. It's what they can no longer avoid. Oscar was taken away. No one waved. No one watched. But no one closed their eyes. In that moment, the courtroom ceased to be a courtroom. It became a crypt where the final gavel did not strike wood but shattered the last ounce of belief a generation held in the righteousness of law. Then, like a ritual pre-written but never performed, the sentence was delivered. And no one stood. Not out of fatigue, nor disrespect, but because standing is the reflex of those who still believe in some form of nobility. Here that last noble thing had been killed, not by the crime, but by the truth. This was no trial. It was a funeral for an era that once believed justice knew its way home. At first, there was only a small, folded piece of paper stuck to the cold stone on the eastern side of the Federal Military Cemetery wall. No name, no address, just 4 trembling words, inked black on white. I turned my back. No one knew who placed it there first. But precisely because no one knew, no one could stop what came next. As if the entire nation was being forced to relearn how to bow, not before a verdict, but before a truth long buried beneath gold-plated honor. Within 3 days of the trial's end, hundreds arrived, not summoned, not organized. They simply came, carrying paper and gilt, each apology handwritten, each voice bearing the shame of a generation that once believed not seeing meant not being involved. Some wrote a single sentence. Some crossed out lines repeatedly. Some cried before pressing their notes onto the stone wall. No one looked back. A boy about 9, wearing a red shirt with a torn shoulder, wrote faintly in pencil, "I don't know why adults have to relearn how to treat heroes." His note rested beside another. "I'm a history teacher. I never taught about Dana Monroe because I was afraid the students would ask why these two pieces didn't speak to each other." But side by side they became a requiem, without music, a silent dirge with no low notes. Only the echo of quiet once mistaken as harmless. A soldier from Louisiana, silver-hailed and slumped-shouldered, lingered for more than 5 hours at the central stone. He didn't cry. He didn't kneel. He simply stood, then posted a brief line at the main gate, where guards usually checked credentials. "Sorry for the time I clapped when he was promoted." A line like a thin blade, but one that pierced the layers of metals once pinned to men like Hasker. Then those who had served under him, quietly, unscheduled, came, adding new slips of paper. One police officer, never seen in public before, arrived just past midnight. Ape low, mask on, sunglasses hiding his face. He wrote neither quickly nor slowly, peeled back tape, pressed his note onto the wall, then stepped away. No glances, no words. His message read, "We didn't stay silent because we didn't see. We stayed silent because we were afraid of seeing ourselves." A confession so cold it seemed to freeze the air around the memorial into untempered steel. No rebuttal followed. No one condemned him. Because truth, even from the shadows, weighs heavier than 1,000 polished speeches from podiums. By the 5th day, ordinary paper gave way to blueprints. A group of architecture students arrived, bringing rough plans. No permits, no sponsors, no contractor signatures. They erected a hollow steel frame 3 meters tall, open in the middle, enough for wind to pass through and carry the notes into its core. It wasn't a traditional monument. No portraits, no relief. Only apology notes, 1,326 of them, pressed onto every face of the frame. Built from recycled steel panels salvaged from former detention center gates. Steel that once locked away the innocent, now holding confessions. People called it the Wall of Apologies. Not by decree, but by whispers among the crowd. No one told anyone, but everyone understood. This wasn't a place for forgiveness. It was a place to remember that justice sometimes doesn't need reclaiming. It needs someone to admit the guilt they silently bore. Monroe gave no speech. He posed for no photos, left no trace. But people saw her from afar, standing among the trees behind the wall. Her hands held no flowers, no microphone, just a single slip of white paper, blank. She didn't post it. She only held it, as if her message wasn't meant to be written but to be lived. Each day new notes appeared. Some written with fountain pens, some in blood. Just a few small words. "I once believed in him." Another flowed like a poem. One was blurred by rainwater, but none were removed, none torn down. Even cemetery janitors paused each morning to read a few lines before starting work. From private shame, the wall became the foundation of new awareness. That it's not just those in power who commit wrong. It is society itself when it chooses to stand still, when it knows but says nothing, when it claps for convenience, when it turns away out of discomfort. That enables the collapse of moral order. Throughout, no one proposed turning it into a tourist site. No tours, no translations, no permanent exhibitions. Because everyone understood this was not a place to look. This was a place to bow one's head, not for the dead, but for the part of their conscience once allowed to die without notice. As the apology notes began to yellow in the wind, and the steel wall at the military cemetery remained cold as the first day, something else quietly spread. Across university lecture halls. Her name, not as a slogan, not on an honors board, certainly not taught as a hero. Dana Monroe entered the curriculum like a fracture, letting students feel the quake beneath foundations once thought unshakable. The National Strategic Officer Academy was the first to change. In the syllabus for leadership and political consequences, the 8th week's lecture carried a single title, not because she was a general, but because she didn't draw her weapon. The words were bolded, no exclamation mark, no footnote, just a title. The lecture hall fell silent the moment it appeared on the big screen. Some furrowed brows, some tilted heads, but no one looked away, because in those 43 characters lay not just a person's name, but a reckoning with an outdated model of power. The lecturer, a retired colonel, did not recount biography. He didn't start with medals or birth dates. He simply replayed a 12-second clip. Monroe standing before the auditorium, eyes fixed on a child, hands unmoving, no persuasion, no command, no defense. And it was that silence that stopped a nationwide collapse. When the clip ended, he turned and softly asked, "Why did she do nothing?" No one answered. Because everyone knew it was precisely because she did nothing that history had to record that moment. A student stood without permission and asked, "Sue, are we learning ethics to handle weapons or to handle ourselves?" There was no answer. But from that day, the Academy shifted its training focus from situational response to ethical consequence comprehension. Not because Dana Monroe was a legend, but because she was the final line the system reached before it fell. At the State University of Constitutional Order in New York, law students were required to participate in a reconstruction trial of Monroe, not to relive the verdict, but so each person could choose a role: juror, defender, witness, even member of the public. Throughout the performance, no correct answers were allowed, only cross-questioning. One group built no courtroom on a stage but held it in an open square between 4 glass walls, so passers-by could look in. They read no scripts. They debated, argued, disagreed. Some cried. Some walked out midway. But when the session ended, no one clapped. They stood still as if they had been judged, not spectators. The Federal Strategic Policy Institute took a different route. In its new curriculum, Monroe's name was not listed under national heroes, but as a boundary case, when the system forces one individual to uphold morality for the collective. The phrasing sparked controversy. Many objected, arguing it diminished her. But that pushback forced the institution to host a 3-day forum titled "Between Silence and Resistance, Who Bears the Gap?" When the media sought Monroe for an interview or a closing statement, she sent only one handwritten line: "If I had to speak, I'd never have risen again from that funeral." No ornament, no oratory, just a refusal stronger than any declaration ever read from a podium. Because Monroe understood she didn't need to be taught as a great woman. She needed to be remembered as the reason future generations are forced to ask, why did a general have to face the full cowardice of a system alone? While her name quietly entered syllabi, the opposing name, Hasker, became a race, through action, not proclamation. During a policy theory seminar at Boston University, a group of seniors inserted a single slide into a presentation, projecting Hasker's image alongside the words, "Not everything once taught deserves to stay." The room fell silent when the professor ignored it. The students stood and left the hall in unison. That quiet act was captured by an observer and, in under a minute, shared millions of times with the hashtag #NotInOurSyllabus. At a military library in Chicago, the staff member in charge of archival materials refused to restore Hasker's mold-damaged manuscript after a roof leak. When questioned, she simply said, "Some things deserve to rot, just like the decay they were born from." That quote later became the tagline for an online campaign urging academic institutions to remove Hasker's work from required reading lists. More than 30 universities joined, not with proclamations but by silently changing their syllabi. His name wasn't printed on stamps. No street was named after him. but it appeared quietly in lecture slides, undergraduate theses on system ethics, and diagrams during crisis management modules. One communications student defended a thesis titled Dana Monroe, The Structure of an Unrefusable Refusal. The paper featured no photo, no quotes, just a deep analysis of the gap between justice and social reaction, using her silence as primary data. Conversely, at an annual Department of Justice conference, when organizers accidentally reused an old video clip in which Hasker spoke about the necessity of pressure and maintaining order, the segment lasted less than 10 seconds before the audience interrupted with collective applause, not in approval, but to shut it down. One attendee stood and asked bluntly, if the system once allowed him to represent us, then maybe the system needs a new representative. No one objected. No one defended. The room went quiet, then shifted to a new topic without prompting. When an education system begins to write someone into its books, it's not because that person was perfect. It's because they woke a part of the mind society had allowed to fall asleep. Dana Monroe didn't enter the curriculum as a female hero. He entered as a silent beat, forcing the next generation to rewrite the rhythm. That new rhythm, quiet but irreversible, is becoming the dominant melody in the next chapter of justice. She doesn't need to stand in a public square. She doesn't need interviews. No grand declarations about inspiration, because even in silence her name has become a verb, an action, a way not to betray oneself in moments when others choose to bow. No fanfare, no press conference, no mention in official news bulletins. Yet on a Monday morning, at the southern courtyard of the Federal Police Headquarters, where once hung a plaque engraved with names of those who had served with honor, a silent void emerged between two gleaming bronze squares. Hasker L. Reynolds' name was no longer there. No one spoke. No one explained. A technician wiped the indentation of the former name with a velvet cloth, then stepped back to make way for the new inscription. Force is not authority. Not a sentence, but a declaration. Cold, resolute, irreversible. From that moment, history did not erase his name. It simply refused to carry it forward. That very evening, an image of the quietly altered honor board was anonymously posted on Reddit by a maintenance worker, accompanied by the caption, "A clean void is better than a filthy honor." The post swiftly climbed trending charts. People began revisiting every instance where Hasker had spoken with sanctimonious demeanor, juxtaposed with leaked trial clips. Social media accounts that once praised him were suddenly labeled cowardly fan pages, compelling owners to delete posts, disable comments, or issue public apologies. The public was unforgiving, not because they had praised him, but because they had used that error to mask their fear. At a small cafe near Capitol Hill, a server brought coffee to an elderly man with graying hair and quietly retracted the stirring spoon. When he inquired why, the server said simply, "Here, we don't provide utensils to those who once ordered beatings of minors just to meet quotas." The customer was Hasker's former media aide. No one confronted him, but adjacent tables immediately emptied. An invisible barrier formed, not out of disgust, but because no one wished to share the air with a decaying legacy. Within the campus of a high-level security training school, students were assigned to write rebuttals to the philosophy of stability through fear, a model Hasker had embedded into text. A first-year student submitted a one-page essay with 4 lines. I don't need to learn how to instill fear. I want to learn how to make others want to stand beside me, not beneath me. And if this system once taught the opposite, then it must relearn. The essay was initially shared internally. Within 3 hours it appeared on nearly 100 academic forums. No one knew the student's name, but everyone referred to it as the manifesto of a generation unwilling to bow. Meanwhile, inside the federal prison, Hasker was relocated, not for security reasons, but because 3 inmates requested not to share space with someone who once viewed law as a whip. One was a former police officer forced to leave the force years ago for refusing to arrest people to meet Hasker's quotas. In a confidential interview, he said simply, "Now I eat in silence, but at least I no longer have to breathe the same air as someone who thought power was a reason not to listen to anyone." Even Hasker's final official portrait, hung in the administrative records room of the National Policy Bureau, did not escape silent purging. A newly transferred young staff member discovered the frame hung upside down, glass shattered, face turned to the wall. When he asked his superior, the reply was one word: "Leave it that way." Since then, whenever the void between the two gleaming bronze squares on the honor board is mentioned, people don't say, "His name was erased." They say, "This space is where we remember we were once wrong." No one corrects it. No one replaces it. No one polishes a new bronze layer, because leaving it empty is the most profound engraving of all. We once placed the wrong person on a pedestal, but we took him down not with hatred but with an unforgivable severance. At the State Police Commendation Archives, a brief memorandum was dispatched to all departments. Revoke all medals, retrieve all recognitions, erase all references to Hasker from the honor system database. No explanations, no mention of ethical violations or reassessment of character, just a single line, no longer aligned with public value standards. Clerks executed the procedure without bowing or sighing, as if it wasn't punishment but garbage disposal. A historical senate at the headquarters of an Eastern Police Academy, where a bust of Hasker once stood in the commemorative courtyard, awoke one Saturday morning to find the statue gone. No one claimed responsibility. Its former spot was replaced with a bare concrete block. Atop it sat a crudely inscribed tin plaque. "No longer represents us." A cadet recorded a clip, posting it with the caption, "This morning I passed by and saw honor return to silence." The clip garnered over 10 million views in less than 2 days. No background music, no effects, just an image of emptiness that evoked a purification deeper than destruction. Then, like a ripple effect needing no headlines, numerous official websites, councils, research institutes, and training centers that once mentioned Hasker quietly removed every photo, biography, and quote. Once symbols of regulation, his presence was erased. No one spoke of it. No one objected. Because justice, once it speaks through silence, renders all justifications mere noise. At a law enforcement policy seminar, when an elderly professor inadvertently cited Hasker as a former symbol of civil control, the auditorium fell silent. No objections, no debate. But the silence was so heavy he paused mid-sentence, adjusted his glasses, and never mentioned the name again. Afterward, a student tweeted, "When an entire classroom chooses not to react, that's when history speaks." Around the same time, an old documentary featuring Hasker as the architect of modern law enforcement policy was permanently removed from a major streaming platform. The reason? Not copyright, but content no longer reflecting community standards. In online discussion groups, users circulated a spliced clip of him speaking about maintaining order with an iron hand, juxtaposed against the empty frame of the dismantled memorial site. No commentary needed. The past was unraveling. The performance, once orchestrated like a fabricated symphony, had come undone. Even the last place retaining remnants of his name, the federal prison where Hasker served time, could no longer remain indifferent to the awakened society's cold wave. The prison's public inbox received over 10,000 emails from veterans nationwide. No chaos, no threats, just clear, succinct messages. No forgiveness. One wrote, "I once marched under the flag he waved. Now I burn that flag with my own hands because it is no longer clean." Another said, "We do not hate. We simply refuse to be represented by a man who used power to trample on honor." A group of former Academy graduates submitted a petition demanding removal of Hasker's signature from their diplomas, proposing new certificates issued without any trace of his involvement. Their reply letter was a single sentence, "We understand." There was no response from the prison, and none was needed. This time, silence was no longer concealment, it was agreement. When Hasker's appeal reached the Supreme Military Court, it was summarily rejected. No debate, no hearing scheduled. Beneath the Chief Justice's signature was a single line, like a final sword stroke, severing a power play spanning administrations. This sentence is not for an individual but for a doctrine of governance by fear. From that moment, no one discussed punishment, because what was condemned was not a man. It was a mechanism that allowed a man to masquerade cowardice as discipline. Now that very mechanism had to wash its face by erasing every trace of the man it once praised. Just one day after the appeal was denied, an unsigned article spread like wildfire across legal forums and social media. We're not appealing the verdict. We are appealing the very belief that once made him trustworthy. That quote appeared on law school posters, printed on T-shirts, and became a rallying slogan at student discussions. No official movement backed it, but the momentum was unstoppable. A software company that once named Hasker a brand ambassador pulled all past advertising, not from backlash, but because no one dared call him a role model for human governance through technology anymore. Financial records followed swiftly. Within 2 hours, a decision terminated all pension payouts, honorary allowances, and reintegration support, with 0 votes against. The reason cited? Not regulatory violation, but violation of the fundamental principle of public trust. No one defined that principle. No one needed to. Hasker's name was erased from the disbursement system by a simple line of code, a silent command erasing an illusion once upheld by public funds. When the official notice reached his cell, the officer folded the paper and placed it on Hasker's breakfast tray without a word. Hasker looked up, ready to react, but no one looked back. Even the guard who held the cell keys had begun referring to him only as inmate 739. Outside, on a national policy analysis podcast, a former cabinet advisor stated bluntly, "If the system once wrote his name in gold ink, then today silence is engraving it in minus signs." That statement was clipped and went viral on Twitter, overlaid with a blurred image of Hasker's face and bold red letters. The only way to dismantle a false symbol is to stop calling him a symbol. At a military hospital, where Hasker had once funded a rehabilitation unit for wounded soldiers, young nurses proposed renaming the facility the Monroe Wing. Initially rejected, over 8,000 signatures from patients and families forced the board to convene an emergency meeting. The renaming was announced quietly, with a new aluminum plaque mounted on the wall. Soon after, a clip surfaced, the original ribbon-cutting moment. Hasker stood stiffly, forced smile in place. Overlaid was footage of the new sign, his name nowhere to be found. The clip lasted 19 seconds, no dialogue, no effects. But it was enough for the entire online community to nod in agreement. There's no need to tear anything down, just return the name to those who deserve it. From that point forward, every act of removal took on a new shape. No longer rejection, but civilized purification. Cold, precise, unspoken, but deeply embedded in public memory. People began to realize so-called cancellation was not the end of a character. It was the birth of a generation unwilling to compromise with cruelty dressed in uniform. No one declared the end of the Hasker era. But from then on, no one referred to him by name, only by his consequence. At the Federal Police Memorial Hall in Denver, where a large photo of Hasker once hung in the main corridor, visitors saw a blank space for the first time. No nameplate, no caption box. Just a patch of repainted wall, slightly off color from the rest, like a scar no longer hiding but no longer wanting to be preserved. A high school student stood still before it for a long time, then wrote in the guest book, "Sometimes silence is how justice exhales." 1 week later, someone quietly taped an A4 sheet to that wall with bold print. Once hung here, a face no longer worthy of being seen. The paper was removed within minutes, but the image had already spread online. Hundreds of copies later appeared at law enforcement facilities, public service counters, and police academy gates. No one claimed responsibility. No one was investigated, because no one wished to protect a symbol once considered a pillar but revealed as a crack between honor and fear. Also in Denver, a group of journalism students made a short documentary about erasing Hasker's image. During filming, they interviewed former staff who served under him. A retired guard broke down on camera, recounting how Hasker ordered a teenage boy isolated for 48 hours simply for looking defiant. The guard spoke slowly, word by word. "I used to think I was protecting order, but I was shielding silence for wrongdoing." That quote was isolated, set to somber music, and went viral with over 5 million shares. Not for sentimentality, but because it was the confession society had long awaited from inside the machine. At a law enforcement history photo exhibition in Texas, when the only image featuring Hasker appeared in the digital archive, a wave of attendees protested its presence, demanding removal. The curator explained it was archival, not honorary. But the next day, someone hacked the system and replaced all captions beneath the photo with red text, "Removed for not representing." Organizers were forced to shut down the entire display system. In their press release, Hasker's name was no longer mentioned. That very attempt at neutrality reignited the question: why did the system that once glorified him take so long to finally fall silent? Inside the prison where Hasker was serving time, a group of inmates quietly moved their beds away from his block, not out of fear, but out of contempt. One evening, someone etched into the stone table where he usually sat the words, "A leader is not someone who instills fear, but someone others choose to follow." The carving was shallow and crude, but when guards came to inspect it, no one scrubbed it out, no one reported it. Only one inmate from the same wing was later transferred without explanation. When a leaked video showed the transfer, capturing Hasker deliberately turning his face away as he walked past the inscription, one still frame was all the online community needed to understand. Sometimes, the most effective punishment does not come from the state, but from no one wanting to share space with a man once called powerful. Dana Monroe made no statement. She did not object, did not approve, did not post, did not appear, because she knew this was not a battle between two people. This was a self-reckoning of a system once deceived by its own manufactured image. Hasker's erasure did not bring her satisfaction, but it confirmed one truth. Collapse does not always come by gunfire, but by no one speaking his name anymore. From now on, when ethics, strategy, and individual responses to collective power are taught, lessons will not begin with the name of the wrongdoer. They will begin with a void, for future generations to look into and understand. Some names once thundered like storms, only to vanish, not because they were defeated, but because no one was willing to repeat them. The silent execution, and justice in the end needs only that. That void is no longer confined to books. It has become a collective reflex. At a seminar at the University of Southern California, when an elderly professor inadvertently referred to Hasker as a worthy model for crowd control, the entire lecture hall stood up at once. Not shouting, not arguing, just stood. That solid silence made it impossible for the professor to continue. And the clip was later titled "The Stand-Up Lesson, When History Can No Longer Stay Silent," gaining 3 million views within 48 hours. No narration, no analysis, just a room full of people rising together at the mention of a once celebrated name. At a police service appreciation ceremony, during the reading of senior commanders who influenced the force over 2 decades, the announcer reached Hasker's name and hesitated. No one asked him to stop, but the hall sank into a dry silence. After a few seconds, he said softly, "This name has been withdrawn," and moved on as if Hasker had never existed. A live stream of that reaction spread rapidly across social media, not for drama, but because its cold detachment felt like the final nail in the coffin of a once untouchable title. Inside his cell, Hasker received a book from the prison library. Upon opening it, the usual printed quote on the inside cover had been replaced by a crude, handwritten line. "Your theory did not save you, and no one wants to read it anymore." No one confirmed who had written it. Prison staff took no disciplinary action. The book had all its pages, violated no rules. But when Hasker tried to return it, no one accepted it back. From that day, the library ceased lending out any materials he had authored, even though they were kept as proof of a mistake once hardbound. At a subway station in the capital, a billboard meant to display portraits of security heroes had been painted over with simple graffiti, an empty square with bleeding red text below it. Not everyone once displayed deserves to be displayed again. City officials initially tried to remove it, but after 3 attempts, each new coat of paint was defaced again. They quietly left it as is, a tacit admission that some lessons are best preserved in ugly ink, so no one repaints them in gold. A group of former police officers, promoted based on Hasker's tactical recommendations, held a closed press conference formally renouncing all prior academic associations. One line in their statement was repeated 3 times. No longer a model, no longer a man, no longer of value. No one interrupted. No one challenged. Because in each of their eyes people saw not regret, but release. A shackle worn too long disguised as effectiveness. The video of that press conference circulated within internal law enforcement forums. A quiet detoxification, unspoken but universally understood as necessary. Hasker did not know these things were happening, but he felt them. Because when his name disappeared from commendation boards, textbooks, training videos, even whispered conversations among old colleagues, that was no longer punishment. It was exclusion. Not from law, but from collective memory. A form of punishment requiring no courtroom, no verdict, no justification, just one silent decision: we will no longer speak of him. When his name vanished from every plaque, every document, every mouth that once defended him, people began to realize what remained was not victory, but a silence. A silence that needed to be filled with something indelible, something that did not belong to power, was not based on title, needed no medal, and that something won. The steadfastness of a woman who stood still as the entire system shook and did not take a single step back. Since the verdict was delivered and his name withdrawn from the roll of honor, the way Hasker was treated changed. Coldly, without a new prosecution, without anyone lifting a hand. One day, after news of his revoked medals appeared in the court's brief announcements section, a veteran once sidelined by Hasker quietly returned a photo taken with him a decade ago. No letter enclosed. It was only a small handwritten note. Never posed with trash. The image later spread on social media, becoming a popular mock wallpaper, captioned, "Once a man, now a mistake." In the courtyard of the federal prison where he served, other inmates, including those sentenced under administrative decisions during his tenure, began silently turning their backs whenever he walked by. No one hit him, no one insulted him, but that collective turning away made each of his steps crackle in the air. Once, when he entered the dining hall, someone dumped an entire shaker of salt into his meal. No one claimed responsibility. No investigation was made. As he screamed, the entire room kept eating, heads down, as if he were yelling in a graveyard no one cared to visit anymore. A group of law students who reenacted the Monroe trial later launched a campaign titled "Erasing the Serpent's Trail," calling for removal of every quote bearing Hasker's name from courses on doctrine and power strategy. They sent hundreds of emails to deans, professors, and curriculum boards. In a video capturing students' reactions as his photo was taken down from the main lecture hall, there was one short cheer, then silence. No laughter. Not a celebration of a fall, but a witness to the final crumbling of a man who once thought himself untouchable. At the annual memorial ceremony for federal security forces, where Hasker had been an honored guest for 6 consecutive years, this year the second chair, reserved for retired high-ranking commanders, was left empty. No one said, no one mentioned it, but on the nameplate someone quietly affixed a strip of black tape. After the ceremony, a freelance photographer captured the moment and posted it on Twitter, captioned, "Honor does not belong to those who once had a seat, but to those no longer deserving of one." The image was instantly shared millions of times, becoming one of those wordless, symbolic moments of severance that needed no proclamation. Dana Monroe did not respond to reporters. She did not step onto any stage nor agree to appear in documentaries. She left behind only a letter. Not long, not sent through any organization, unsigned, ceremonially. It was printed in a single copy, folded and placed in a plain white envelope with no recipient's name. On the outside, in a gentle yet resolute hand, it read, "For those who will continue living." The letter began with a single sentence, a sharp slash across the habit of building monuments to forget the truth. I do not wish to become a symbol, because symbols are often used to erase facts. No rallying cry, no elaboration. But from that moment on, every leadership and ethics syllabus was forced to re-examine its purpose. Were they honoring someone or concealing something? At a prestigious military academy that once used Hasker's speeches as strategic case studies, the lecturer entered with a blank board, no slides, no documents, carrying only a printout of Monroe's letter. He read each line aloud, without inflection, without pause. When he read the first sentence, a cadet seated mid-row abruptly stood, tore out a notebook labeled Crisis Control Strategy, Hasker, and threw it straight into the trash. An act not encouraged, but not stopped either, because everyone understood some things must be discarded, not for flawed content, but for corrupted essence. In the days that followed, numerous scholars who had previously cited Hasker's power models submitted withdrawal letters requesting the removal of acknowledgments they once called academic pillars. A major academic journal was forced to cancel an entire special issue titled Postmodern Strategic Legacy because 3 featured studies were based on his ethical arguments. The chief editor resigned, leaving behind a single sentence at his press conference. "We once believed he was the mind of the system, but it turns out he was only the rationale of cowardice." At the same time, a group of young veterans began a graffiti campaign across subway stations near the Federal Administrative District. Not tributes to Monroe, but symbols of silence. A sealed mouth, a lone figure standing among empty chairs. Beneath each image, just one line. She did not step back. These images quickly spread on social media, but most striking was one painted directly over the iron door that once bore Hasker's name at the old police headquarters, now an abandoned administrative site. A soldier walking by stopped, took a photo, and quietly posted it with the caption, "I used to serve under him." She never mentioned herself, never mentioned victory, never recounted the trial, never spoke the name that had been erased. Instead, she wrote about one image no one had noticed but no one could forget. That afternoon, amid a row of soldiers saluting in formation, stood a 12-year-old girl, the daughter of a fallen serviceman, silent, her left hand raised to her forehead in salute, his right hand trembling uncontrollably. No one told her to salute, no one asked her to be there, but she stood solemn and shaking, as if her father's loss had transmuted into something greater, a silent vow to the country, bypassing the government. Monroe wrote, "I do not remember the eyes of the adults that day, but I remember that girl, and if anything kept me standing without drawing my weapon, it was that image." In a society drowned by declarations and symbol wars, the sincerity of those words was like pure metal, cold, heavy, unbreakable. There was no tribute ending, no call to arms. The letter closed with one short line, without flourish. "If one day you find yourselves at gunpoint, remember I did not step back, not to challenge, but to remind that the choice not to retreat does not belong to the powerful, but to those brave enough to remain upright in moments when the whole world deems bowing down as wise." That letter, once delivered to the Federal Strategic Archives Center, was later proposed by a former cadet to be engraved not on stone, not in a museum, but on the main gate of the Pentagon. The proposal faced fierce opposition for weeks. No valid reason to reject it was ever found. In the end, the board ruled the full letter would not be engraved. Only one line would be placed below the central slogan of the Department of Defense. "Neither bow down nor press others down." Beneath it, in small letters carved like an echo, "If one day you find yourselves at gunpoint, remember I did not step back." There was no plaque ceremony, no cameras. Only young soldiers passed by each day, pausing for a few seconds, reading and moving on. Not because they did not understand, but because they knew that understanding something like that often requires an entire lifetime of keeping one's back straight. The words carved into stone do not echo loudly, but the silence around them resounds forever. And sometimes it is that very sound, neither shrill nor boastful, that forces those who once thought themselves untouchable to live under the unending echo of contempt. 1 week after the inscription was carved onto the main gate of the Pentagon, the photograph of Hasker that had hung in the reception corridor for former commanders was found replaced. No official order. No one could identify who did it. But when security discovered it, the new image had already been fastened with 4 steel bolts. It was not a photo of Monroe, nor was it any other image of honor. It was simply a pure whiteboard with a line written in red ink by hand. No one remembers those who knelt before fear, only those who stood still when it mattered. Below that, someone had taped a small handwritten note in pencil. Not everyone is forgotten, some are erased. When Hasker was escorted out for morning exercise, he had to pass through a hallway where other inmates had drawn mocking symbols on the wall with charcoal. His face was distorted, framed like a wanted poster with a sarcastic caption, "Charge cowardice with a weapon." The warden ordered it erased, but no one dared to do it, because everyone knew scrubbing those markings would not erase what he had left behind. It would only make people remember more. At a closed meeting of the National Security Strategy Council, where Hasker had been a speaker for over 10 years, a young aide proposed removing all his references from the internal archive. An elderly general objected, attempting to justify it. We should preserve them to compare past strategies. The aide said nothing, but the next day all copies were returned to storage, labeled "Materials that distort ethical standards." No announcement. But the entire council understood. When trust is fractured, no theory can patch it back together. A 38-second video clip was uploaded online over a weekend, showing a group of high school students visiting the Pentagon. As they passed the gate bearing Monroe's inscription, one girl stopped and read it aloud. The person filming captured the moment. A middle-aged man, later identified as the officer who once served as Hasker's secretary, walked by and immediately turned his face away. The student watched him, then turned to her friend and said clearly, "That man probably remembers, but he doesn't dare stop." That line instantly became a viral audio on TikTok, with millions using it as a soundtrack to expose cowardice in many fields. In the comments, one veteran wrote, "We don't need anyone to bleed for justice anymore. We just need enough people brave enough to name cowardice for what it is." And so, when all the noise fades, when the debates end, when the photographs, documents, and once powerful faces have all fallen from the walls of honor, thank you for joining us on this journey today. In a world that can feel heavy, it's the smallest acts of kindness and courage that light the way forward. Each gesture of compassion, each stand for justice, reminds us that together we can heal and uplift one another. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. And if you want to be part of a community that believes in the power of kindness, consider subscribing. Remember, as the poet Rumi said, raise your words, not your voice. It is rain that grows flowers, not thunder.